Okay, well, look, let's move on and let's move on to warfare and Ukraine. And we're going to start off with, speaking of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, speaking at Davos last week. Let's just have a listen to what she said here.
But I think we in the West also need to understand that victory that President Zelensky spoke about and that time which he said we need to use, it's not about doing Ukraine favors that we're talking about. Supplying Ukraine with weapons, and as President Zelensky very crucially pointed out, supplying Ukraine with the money it needs to win the war is ultimately in our own self-interest. So I'm a finance minister, and if you were to say to me, what is the one thing that G7 finance ministers, G7 governments this year could do that's actually in our power, right? We don't control COVID. We don't control global supply chains. We don't control whether there will be immaculate disinflation or not. One thing where we have some real practical levers is we can help Ukraine win clearly, definitively. And if we do that, if that happens this year, you know it as well as I do, Fareed, that would be a huge boost to the global economy.
Sorry, I should have said before we put Chrystia on, of course, she is the Canadian finance minister. So we're going to fund and arm Ukraine in order to push forward and develop the global economy. That seems to be what she's saying. Certainly what Maria Zakharova thought. Here she is. She said the granddaughter of the Melnikovist from the Nazi allied Ukrainian insurgent army, who in recent years has repeatedly reminded herself of herself by open support for the Nazis in Ukraine and Russophobic statements. Canada's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, Chrystia Freeland, has stated publicly that Russia's defeat would be a huge boost to the global economy. This is a 21st century war for resources, plain and simple. So that is Maria Zakharova's attitude to this. Just to make the point about Chrystia Freeland and the Nazi connection, here's Consortium News from a couple of years ago, of 2017, in fact, the Nazi skeleton in the closet. Freeland's grandfather, according to Canadian sources, says Consortium News, her grandfather graduated from Lviv University in Western Ukraine with a master's degree in law and political science. He began a career with the Galician newspaper Dilo, published in Lviv. After the start of World War II, the Nazi administration appointed him to be editor of the newspaper News of Krakow. So strong connections there between her family in the past and literally the Nazi party. David, perhaps it's a stretch, perhaps it isn't a stretch, we don't really know, to say that maybe it's unfair to say that she feels the same, but this is certainly her background, and the support for that section of Ukrainian society has been pretty clear over the last several months.
Well, she's a finance minister. This is how she identifies. She didn't identify herself as a Nazi. She identified herself as a finance minister, looking at international finance and international economics. So let's look at her economic prescription for a healthy economy. It's victory, not peace. It's victory. Which economic program does that remind you of? It's essentially the same as the economic program of Nazi Germany, which was a lot of public spending and a lot of boosting of the economy to a point where it was about to collapse, and then invasion of surrounding countries, and the solution to economic woes was going to be victory. So at least in her economic policies, if nothing else, I don't know what's in her heart, there are similarities there that are concerning.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Now, also at Davos last week, Boris Johnson was there, of course, and well, he was very thankful that the Pinchuk Fund for hosting the Ukrainian breakfast at Davos. The session, he said, demonstrated the unity across nations that Ukraine must and will win, We must ensure that Zelensky has the tools he needs to finish the job. This is the moment to double down. And so, doubling down indeed, the following day, he heads off to Ukraine to be the guest of Mr. Zelensky. And here's the Defence of Ukraine tweeting out, "Friends like these," this is Boris Johnson, "are worth more than a squadron of tanks. We're glad to welcome Boris Johnson to Ukraine, a person who's been with the Ukrainian people since day one." Before we move on to the issue of tanks, Brian, what are your thoughts on Boris's trip, his continued support? What's he up to here?
Well, that's a good question, Mike. What is he up to, and who's he working for? Is he there representing the British government, or is he there working for people behind the scenes, the globalist masters in Davos themselves, maybe? What is he doing there? Who's paying for his trip? Is this through the Foreign Office, effectively, or is this a private trip for private discussions with Zelensky? The key bit is that the UK public doesn't know, and we need to know. But what he isn't doing there, we can be 100% sure of. He is not calling for an end to the fighting. He's not there to protect lives. I think that he's gone there because they are now desperate to try and keep Ukraine fighting. And as we shall see in just a few minutes, the reality is that Ukraine is losing, and they are starting to lose badly. The cracks are appearing. So Boris has been sent in order to try and shore up the Zelensky regime, this is my opinion, in order to keep the fighting going. We've got bankers there. You showed the lady. She's not interested in peace. She believes that if they can continue the fight, there can be economic, monetary benefit out of it. These are very dangerous individuals.
Right. Well, you asked the question who funded it, so let me just mention that the person who funded the breakfast at Davos was Victor Pinchuk Foundation. Now, Victor Pinchuk is a Ukrainian businessman oligarch worth something in the region of $1.5 billion. But his foundation, just to give an idea of the background here, supports and works with a variety of partners, including the network Yalta European Strategy, created to promote Ukraine's European integration. Also, the Clinton Global Initiative, the Kiev School of Economics, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, the Brookings Institution, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, the Israeli Presidential Conference facing tomorrow, and the Legal Clinics Legal Aid projects of the Renaissance Foundation. So perhaps that's where he's getting the money from, Brian.
Well, you've nailed it down there. Every time we look into our politicians and what they're doing, yes, they might be working inside the national government system part of the time, but the rest of the time, they're deeply involved with think tanks or trusts or overseas groups, whoever those may be. And those people are completely unaccountable. I think we are now absolutely in the phase where national governments have been subsumed into this globalist structure. And when we see the politicians, the chosen few, because it's clear that the rest of them don't understand what's going on, but when we're looking at the chosen few like Boris Johnson, they are simply now being used as the puppets for the globalist policy. And of course, to do this needs huge amounts of money. So we're looking at the hedge funds, we're looking at the huge non-governmental organizations, Bill and Melinda Gates, Tony Blair, to name a few.